My lecture today is about content management systems, and more specifically Wordpress, which is the one that we'll be using in this unit. So, definition here: a content management system, often abbreviated to CMS, is a computer application that allows publishing, editing, and modifying content, organizing, deleting, as well as maintenance from a central interface. Such systems of content management provide procedures to manage workflow in a collaborative environment. So, CMSs generally have two sets of interfaces. They have the admin interfaces, which allow authorized users to edit and publish content as well as configure the site. And then you have the front-end interfaces, or the front-end interface, which is what the public sees when they come and visit your site. So the actual published content that you want people to see. So these are normally defined by a theme or a template, which determines how the content will appear. And we'll get into more detail on that later. So hopefully I've convinced you by now of the benefits of using dynamic web technologies versus static web technologies. So the benefits of using a CMS are essentially all of those that we get with dynamic web technologies. Okay, so CMSs are built on top of dynamic web technologies. But in addition to that, they have some benefits in and of themselves. So probably the biggest, most obvious benefit, first of all, is the fact that non-technical users can update content, modify content, do whatever they want with content, publish content using a CMS. So a big part of it is about providing user-friendly visual interfaces for non-technical users to be able to add content to the database, but in such a way that they're just typing it into a visual interface that way, and then the CMS handles the backend that way. So rather than on the right there actually going in and having to manually code the content into the files, we have an interface like the add new post interface on WordPress here on the left, okay, which is hopefully to a non-technical user much more user-friendly and intuitive. You get lots of functionality out of the box. Okay, so things like database integration, user management and access control, document version control, taxonomies, so having categories and tagging your content, being able to search your content, automating certain tasks. That might be, for example, you want to publish a post at a certain date. You want to write it. You want to write it now, but you don't want to publish it until tomorrow morning or in a week's time. You can set that up. Localization, so you can have your content translated to different languages. Content syndication, so quite often when you set up a website, you'll have an RSS feed. Okay, something like WordPress will do that automatically for you. And then the whole concept of themes, which we'll obviously get into more detail about. So that's functionality that just comes standard with the core functionality of a CMS like WordPress. But then with most CMSs, you can extend that functionality even further by installing plugins. So it is worth mentioning that there are some disadvantages of using a CMS, okay, and these should be reasonably obvious, or some of them should be. So first of all, they are more complicated to set up, so there's a bit more time that you need to invest before you actually get going on creating a site. They sort of have what I've called here a one-size-fits-most approach, which means that because you're using someone else's platform and they've designed it to suit a certain scenario, then if you're going to try and do something outside of that scenario, or quite far outside that scenario, you might find it difficult to get something designed to do one thing to do something quite different. So that's not to say that that's always a disadvantage, because in the great majority of cases, your scenario of what you're developing will probably fit within what they've intended you to use the CMS for. So if you're doing a website that's much like other websites that exist, which most of the time you are, then that's not a problem. It's only usually if you're trying to do something really out of the ordinary or really different or really specialized for some reason that maybe a generalized CMS won't suit what you need to do. Migrating content can be difficult, so if you decide to go with one CMS and then sometime later on you decide to go with a different one, it can be difficult to get your content out of one CMS and into another one, although a lot of them do offer ways of actually doing that isn't too difficult. And the fourth one here says that the common code base can lead to security risks. So this might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but the fact that you're using a code base that lots of other people are using, by that virtue makes it actually I guess a target for people to attack. So if there's someone malicious and they're looking for security holes in software, okay, and they know that millions and millions of people are using this particular piece of software, then they know they can, if they find a security hole, then potentially millions of people will be vulnerable to that. Okay, so none of these are necessarily reasons to not use it, but they're just things to be aware of, and you can mitigate most of these disadvantages anyway. Just a couple of cases where you might not want to use a CMS. So there's only really two scenarios where I can see that you wouldn't want to use a CMS. The first is if you absolutely know that you have a very small website with very little content and it's static content and it will probably never ever change. Then in that case, the process of creating the website statically might actually be quicker. The overhead of setting up an elaborate CMS solution might not actually be of any benefit. But you want to be really sure that it's going to be a website that doesn't change. And the frequency with which you'll create those websites in this day and age is not very high. And then the other scenario I would say that a CMS might not be viable is if the design and or architecture of your website is highly unique or specialized. As I said before, attempting to make it work with an out-of-the-box solution might be counterproductive. So in this case, you might figure that actually creating your own CMS or doing it some different way might be better. I don't envisage that anyone's websites for this unit will fall into that category. I imagine that they'll all work nicely within WordPress, but that's just something to maybe be aware of in the future. Okay, so assuming that we are going to go with the CMS, we should probably talk about what CMSs there are. And the answer to that is a lot. So I've got a link here to a Wikipedia article which lists a whole bunch of content management systems. Okay, and you can see there's dozens and dozens of them. Okay, written on different platforms, all doing slightly different things, but all doing similar things at the same time. Okay, so there is lots and lots to choose from. So when you're choosing a CMS, some of the things that you need to look at is first of all your needs. Okay, what's your technical needs, and also what's your knowledge as a developer, as a designer? What are the client's needs? So what content is there to be managed? What costs they might have? Okay, because you can get free and paid solutions. It can range anywhere from free to quite expensive, and the time frame that you have for development maybe. And then the CMS options. So things like licensing, development team, security, accessibility and code quality, documentation and training support. So often you'll find that the commercial CMSs, the value that they add is actually not so much in the software itself, but in the support and training that comes with them. So don't necessarily think that by using a free CMS that you're actually getting lesser quality, because it's not actually the case. So you want to look at what are the requirements of your website from a design perspective, from a financial perspective, from a technological compatibility perspective, and you want to sort of ask these questions of your website now and also try and project into the future. Because what might suit your website now might not necessarily suit it a year down the track or 10 years down the track. And that can be very hard questions to answer, but it's worthwhile thinking about that. So to figure out which CMS solution best meets these requirements, all I can really suggest is research. Now, obviously, we've chosen the CMS for you for this unit, but in the future, it's unlikely that you'll do every single website with the same set of tools. So my suggestion there is to research, because you want to make the wrong decision earlier rather than later. You don't want to get 3/4 of the way through developing a website, realize the CMS that you're using doesn't do what you want to do, and then have to change and start again. So there's a link here to a website called opensourcecms.com, which actually has a link to a bunch of default installs for various different open source CMSs, which you can, and they'll give you a demo login, so you can actually log into them and try them out and see what they look like without having to go through the process of downloading them and installing them on your own server. So that's a quick way of trying out what various different CMSs are like. Now, in terms of choosing a CMS for this unit, this is kind of a bit of an arbitrary graph, but these are sort of the 3 CMSs that we debated which one of these to use for this class, and they're all based off a similar technology, so they all work off PHP MySQL database. So the 3 of these are WordPress, Joomla, and Drupal, and I've put them on this graph, which is sort of just made up by me and is a bit arbitrary, but generally what you'll find with CMSs is that the more complex they are, the more versatile they are. So the simpler ones are a bit simpler to use, but may restrict you a little bit more in how in what types of sites you can create, or how general the site can create. But then the more flexible ones tend to have a higher learning curve. Now this graph probably misrepresents that a little bit because there's overlap here, and there's not actually that huge amount of difference. But the one that we ended up going with was WordPress, obviously. And so these are some of the reasons that we chose it. So first of all, it's a good platform to ease you into the world of CMSs. Okay, it's relatively simple in terms of CMSs that exist to use. And that's not to say that it's not powerful. It is still very powerful, but the learning curve tends to be a bit lower than for some other CMSs. It's free and open source. It's very popular. Okay, it's probably the most popular CMS that's used. By some estimates, it's used by 19% of all the websites in the world. Okay, so that's a lot. It has excellent documentation, plenty of third-party tutorials, and it has a few years behind it now and is still being actively developed, so it's unlikely to go away anytime soon. So if you start using it now, I mean, that can be the other risky thing about using a new and upcoming CMS, and there's lots of these come up all the time, but they tend to come and go, and so you might choose a new one that looks good, but it might disappear in a year and then suddenly not progress with however the web itself tends to progress in the future. So the fact that WordPress has been around since 2001, okay, that's getting on for 15 years now, is a good sign. It's probably going to be around for a while longer. And as well, the fact that it's, so the install base is so wide. It has a good track record of upgrading to new features without breaking old ones, which is helpful. Some other CMSs, when they create a new version, they make it very difficult or impossible to upgrade your website without recreating it, which is sort of very counterproductive to the whole idea of not repeating work. And it runs on the very common Apache, MySQL, and PHP server stack with whatever operating system underneath that you want to run. Okay, the server requirements for WordPress as of WordPress 3.2 are pretty simple. Requires PHP version 5.2.4 or greater, MySQL version 5.0 or greater, and Apache is the recommended HTTP server, but you don't have to use it. You can use any HTTP server. So they're the requirements that I gave you when telling you to set up your web hosting. So as long as you've got those three things, then you should have no problems running WordPress on your web hosting. Now I want to make a special mention of this, the difference between WordPress.org and WordPress.com, because a few people each time we run this unit get confused by this and end up going and buying a WordPress.com account, which you actually can't use for this unit. So the difference between these two, WordPress.com is a hosted solution for WordPress blogs. It's essentially like Tumblr, but using WordPress as the blogging platform. Okay, you get an account, and then you use their interfaces to publish content, and they give you a URL, something.wordpress.com. Now that's fine for keeping a simple blog, like a Tumblr would be. It's essentially their competitor Tumblr or Blogger or something like that. But you don't get access to the server. Okay, you can't modify the files, you can't change the theme. And really all you can do is just post content to it. So because you need to create your own theme for this Unis project, you can't use that solution. So you don't want to go and get a WordPress.com account. Now WordPress.org is the website that actually hosts the WordPress files, where you download the WordPress files, which you can then install on your own web server. Okay, so that's the one that we want to use. We want to download the WordPress files, install them on our own web server. Okay, and WordPress.org then also contains all the documentation related to how to use and develop for WordPress. So I'll just run over the steps of installing WordPress on your remote web server. And I'll have these slides up after the lecture so that you can go back over this. I'd suggest trying this yourself before the next lot of tutorials. If you run into trouble, don't worry, we can help you out, or you can the past tutes might be good for that as well. But it's worth just going over the steps briefly here anyway. So there's a link to actually the WordPress documentation. They call their documentation section the WordPress Codex. So these steps are basically abbreviating the same information that you'll find in there. So there's four main steps to installing WordPress. Downloading the WordPress install package and uploading it to your server, creating the MySQL database, editing a configuration file so that WordPress, which basically points the WordPress files to your database, and then creating an administrator account in WordPress and start using it. So step one, installing the WordPress package. You want to download it from wordpress.org, not .com. Okay, there's a big download button. It's very easy. It'll download as a zip file. Okay, you extract it, and you'll get a bunch of files here. Okay, these are all the WordPress core files. And then you want to upload those to your web server. So you log into your web server with FTP. Let's see if I can, I can zoom. Okay, you log into your web server with FTP, and you'll have a folder on your web server, which is your web, what we call the web document root, or the base folder that when you type in your URL, it points to that folder. Okay, and that's often called public_HTML. You want to copy across the WordPress files to that. Now this diagram sort of indicates that I'm copying across the WordPress folder itself. What you actually really want to do is copy across the contents of that folder, not the folder itself. If I copy across the folder itself, then my users are going to have to go to www.mydomain.com/WordPress. Okay, because it's in that WordPress folder inside of that inside of my document root. So it's not technically a problem, but you don't want your users to have to add /WordPress to the end of the URL when they're going to your website. Okay, so we want to copy the contents of the WordPress folder to our web root directory. Step two is we want to create the database. So when you set up your web hosting, you should have been given a URL and login details to a web hosting control panel, okay, such as cPanel. cPanel is a very common one, but your hosting might have given you something different, which is fine. They're all very similar. They're just a web interface for administering your website. Now, one of the things that this interface should allow you to do is to create and manage MySQL databases. And actually, some hosts will even give you a one-step WordPress setup button. Okay, but assuming they don't, it's not difficult to set it up yourself. If you do have cPanel, cPanel itself has a bunch of very good tutorials, and I've got a link there to their documentation about adding a MySQL database, and but I'll also detail the process here with some screenshots. So this is what the cPanel interface looks like, and if you have a different one, it will look similar, I'm sure. There should be somewhere where you can administer MySQL databases. Okay, in this case, it's that one there. So we click on that, and this is a sort of step-by-step wizard which allows you to set up a database. Now, when it comes to a database, there's really only a couple of things you need to know. First, you need to name the database. Okay, and if you have multiple databases, they need to have different names, which is logical enough. So I put in the name of the database and click Create Database. And then you actually have to have a MySQL user account for WordPress to access that database. So there's just, again, a level of security so that no one can just go in and access your database. So we have different user accounts for different parts of WordPress, but this one is an account we set up to actually access the database. So we create a username and a password, and once we've done that, we have to assign that user that we've created privileges to access that database. Okay, so there's a section here that says add user to database, and we select the user that we created and the database that we created and hit submit. Okay, and then the final step of this is it'll come up with a screen full of checkboxes that ask us what privileges we want to allow that user to have on the database. And in the case of WordPress, okay, it's going to need to do all of these things, so we just select all privileges. Okay, and then that's the database setup. Now, if your hosting doesn't have a setup wizard, okay, there's other ways of administering the database. Often you'll have something called php-myadmin, and this is what actually the QUT hosting uses. So if you're ever using QUT hosting trying to set up a database, this is what you'll have to use. But essentially it's the same thing. You'll have a user account, the php-myadmin, and you'll create a database. Okay, so once we've created the database successfully, we need to put into the WordPress's configuration file the details of how to access that database, where it's going to store all of our content. So the WordPress directory that you uploaded to your web server will contain a file called wp-config.php, and you need to edit this file and then re-upload it to your server with the name wp-config.php, so you lose the hyphen sample part at the end. Okay, and this is what you need to edit. So this is what wp-config sample.php looks like, and basically you can see it's a bunch of PHP and it's all calling this function called define. And really this is just another way of creating variables in PHP. So we say define and then we give it a name and then we give it a value here. So these will be either blank or placeholders here, but all you need to do is change these 4 bits of information to match the information for the database that you've created. So the first part will be the database name, so you will have given that database a name. The second will be the username and password of the MySQL user that you created. And then the last bit will be the MySQL host name. Okay, so the host name is like the web address specifically for the database. Now quite often, in most cases, you can just leave it as localhost, because in most cases it will be the the MySQL database will actually be running on the same server as your web server, in which case localhost just says use this same server to find MySQL. Now it's possible that you can run MySQL on a different server, and if you have a large website, okay, that can often be the case. In that case, or if for some reason your hosting does use a separate server for MySQL, again in your setup email, and if it's not there in your cPanel, you should be able to find the MySQL database host. Okay, but the first thing to try, and in most cases, 9 out of 10 cases, localhost will work there. Okay, you'll know immediately if it doesn't work because the website won't work. But those are the 4 bits of information that you need to modify. Then you need to re-upload this file without the -sample on the end. Okay, so that it ends up on your server just being wp-config.php. And then the final step is creating an administrator account for your WordPress site. So once you've linked it to the database, you go to your domain and it will come up with some setup screens. Okay, it will run some scripts to install things, create the database, all of the tables that it needs in the database. And then the last thing it needs you to do is create an administrator account for WordPress. Okay, so again, we don't just want anyone to be able to log in and create posts and delete things in our WordPress, so we need to create an account. And there's different levels of user access in WordPress, okay, and the highest of those is an administrator, and an administrator allows you to do anything. So obviously you need at least one administrator account for your WordPress site, and then if you want, you can set up other accounts later on. If you want to set up an account for someone else to be a content publisher on your site, then you can do that. Okay, so for example, on my dave.if90.net blog, I've set up an account for Cassie to be a content editor so that she can put posts on there and stuff, but I haven't given her admin privileges so that she can't do things like install plugins and change configuration settings. Okay, so this is the screen, this is the installation screen where we set up the administrator account. So we put in a few bits of information here. We can give the site a title, but the important part is creating a username for the admin account. That defaults to admin, but you can change that to whatever you want. If you want, you can change that to your name. And then you create a password for this here, and if you want, you can enter your email in there as well. Okay, then you hit install WordPress, and it does everything for you, and then you have WordPress set up. So what exactly is in the WordPress installation? What's in all of those files that you've downloaded from wordpress.org? So the answer to that is mostly it's a bunch of PHP files and other resources, so HTML, CSS, images, JavaScript, stuff like that, that create all of that built-in functionality that we detailed earlier. Okay, all of those features that it has, all the core features, as well as displaying the administration interfaces and some default front-end themes. Okay, so it has to have something in there to show those administrator interfaces, and then so that there is something there on the front end to show potential content that you might add. It has some default themes. So much of this is in the form of PHP functions that we can call upon when building our site's theme. So if you actually look through the WordPress installation files, okay, you'll see it's mostly a bunch of files with PHP functions in them. So this, for example, is just a screenshot I took from one of the files called generaltemplate.php, which has the function getHeader. And this is a function that we'll actually use in our templating, which will do essentially what we did in the last time we did tutorials, where we split up our file into all those component parts, and we said include the header.php. Okay, this function essentially does exactly that, okay, but does some other checks and things first of all. So while you don't need to remember this at all, and you probably will rarely, if ever, actually go in and need to look at these files, it's nice to know that there's no magic going on here, okay? It's all just plain old PHP. Okay, and usually they're functions that we can call and leverage the functionality of WordPress. So again, a little bit about WordPress interfaces. So WordPress interfaces can be divided into the admin interfaces and the public interfaces. We might also refer to these as the backend and the front-end interfaces respectively. So the admin or backend interface, this is where you do all of your content management. Okay, so things like editing posts, moderating comments, installing plugins and themes, managing user accounts, all of that sort of stuff. To access the admin interfaces requires a login. Okay, that login which you set up in that final step of the WordPress installation. And you access the admin interfaces by going to the URL, well, essentially your URL, and then adding /wp-admin to the end. Okay, that's how you access the admin interfaces. And if you aren't already logged in, it will redirect you through a login page and then back to that address. So this is what the admin interface looks like, or looked like in a slightly previous version of WordPress. Okay, I'm sure most of you have seen a WordPress installation before. Okay, but this is what we mean when we're talking about the admin or the backend interfaces. So it's got all of these sections down the side, okay, which allow you, or it usually starts with a dashboard which gives you a bit of an overview of your site and what's going on. And then you've got various different sections down the side where you can either publish content, change the appearance of the site, install plugins, manage users, okay, and then various sections for tools and settings. Okay, it's where all of the administration of your site happens. Okay, so the public never sees this interface. This is for you and whoever else is an administrator of your site or a content publisher of your site to use. And then we've got the public or front-end interface. So this is what the public visitors to your site will actually see when they go to your URL. Okay, and to access that, it's just whatever your URL is. Okay, as long as your WordPress files are sitting in that root web directory. So when you're developing your site's theme, you'll want to go back and forth between the front and the back end to check that the changes that you've made have worked correctly. So this is the default view of the public front-end interface. Okay, and again, this is a slightly older version of WordPress, but it's much the same. Okay, so you get a default theme so that it does show something, and then they usually have some default content here. So they have a default post and a default page here, and then a sidebar with some content in it there. And then you can go from there. If you want to use the default theme, you can just start publishing content, or you can install a different theme, or in our case, we'll be creating our own. Okay, so we should talk about the content types in WordPress. And there's actually only two content types, and they're very similar to each other. You could almost say they're two variations of the one content type. Okay, but we'll talk about them as two content types. By default, there are only two types of content you can publish using WordPress: posts and pages. Okay, and both posts and pages contain two bits of sub-content, a title and then a content area. Okay, and whatever you want to go into that content area can go in that content area. It's usually text with images and videos and whatever other content you might want to put in. Okay, but it's how they're intended to be used and how they end up being displayed within our theme that actually makes these things different. So we'll start off with pages. WordPress pages are generally reserved for static content, so that is content that doesn't change frequently and whose relevance does not change with time. Okay, so a good example of that is something like an about page. Okay, so if you've got a site and you've got a section where you're constantly updating posts, okay, you don't want to, or you're constantly updating news items or portfolio items or whatever, you don't want to embed your about page in that so it ends up getting pushed down the page and lost. Okay, the about page is something that should remain equally as relevant now as it will later on. So something like that is suitable for a page content type. Now pages can have a hierarchy, which means that you can have pages with parent pages and child pages. Okay, so you might have a lot of content that you want to break up into sections and subsections, and you can do that with pages, but you can't tag them and you can't categorize them. Okay, so they're not as flexible as posts in terms of what taxonomy we can apply to them. With pages, you can create custom template files for different pages to change their layout or look. Okay, so you can actually create a different template for different pages, and then apply those different templates to the different pages if you want them to look different. Okay, but overall, pages are less flexible than posts. Okay, so probably most of your content you actually want to implement as posts. So WordPress posts are generally news or informational updates. Multiple posts can be output in a view, so that's a big difference between pages. So with posts you can have, I use the word view rather than, I'm trying to avoid the word page to avoid confusion with the page content type. Okay, but so when I say view, I mean you are going to a particular page on your site. Okay, but that may or may not be a content type of page. It's possibly a slightly unfortunate way that they've named this, but I think you need to start thinking of WordPress, the content that WordPress gives you as a view, as a combination of various different content output to the screen rather than a page. So with posts, you can output multiple posts either in their entirety or in a summary on a single view. Okay, a single page, and that's something you can't do with page content types. Now, by default, posts are listed in their reverse chronological order. Okay, so that because they're intended to be sort of time relevant. So you want more recent posts to be more prominent in the display order to show at the top, and then older posts get pushed down the bottom. When multiple posts are shown, usually a summary or excerpt of the post is shown, which links to the full content view of the post. Posts can be categorized and tagged. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature of using posts, so that you can separate posts of different, well, I guess different categories or different tags, and view them as separate from the entire list of posts. So posts might represent a blog. Okay, so that's the common default idea of what a post is. It's a news item in a blog. Okay, but they can just as easily represent any other content. Okay, for example, a portfolio item. A lot of people jump in this assignment with WordPress and just go on and say, well, I'll just make a page called portfolio and I'll put all my content in there, not realizing that restricts you with how you can actually use that content. If you actually create your portfolio items as individual posts, then you have much more freedom with how you can actually display them in any given view across your website. So if you do create a portfolio item as an individual post, then you can do things like tag that particular item or categorize it, and then you can, let's say you have various different categories of portfolio items, like you might have graphic design works, you might have photography works, you might have web design works. Okay, then you could view those posts in different categories by categorizing them. If you had to just put them in different pages, then you wouldn't be able to do that necessarily. So posts are by far the more flexible content type in WordPress, and are the type of content that you should be using most. Unless you generally do have a bit of static content which like an about page remains relevant regardless of when it was posted, and that you don't have any real need to categorize or tag in any particular kind of way. Okay, so a little bit about WordPress themes. So how WordPress displays your website's content to its users is controlled by a theme. So as far as WordPress is concerned, the content is just text in a database. Okay, so you actually have complete flexibility about how that's output in terms of using the WordPress theme. Okay, so a WordPress theme is essentially just a collection of PHP template files, and again other assets, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, whatever else needs to go under the theme, which control how the content is displayed to the user. But the most important part of the theme will be those PHP template files. Okay, they're what actually contains the calls to WordPress functions that go and get the content out of the database and then insert it into the page that the user's viewing. WordPress themes can be packaged and shared for anyone with WordPress to install. So WordPress itself hosts a repository of free themes at that URL that's there. Okay, so you can go there and you can browse through existing themes and install those very easily if you want. And in addition, many other sites offer both free and paid WordPress themes as well. Okay, so that's a screenshot of the WordPress themes directory. Okay, and generally there'll be a screenshot of the theme and then a description of the theme. Okay, and they'll have those tagged in various different ways as well. So in terms of whether you use a pre-made theme or create your own, okay, it's worth noting the advantages and disadvantages of both firstly. So with a pre-made theme, the advantages are fairly obvious. Okay, you don't have to go to all the effort of creating your own theme. So it's quick and easy. You just get a theme, download if it's free, pay for it and download it if it's not free, and then install it on your WordPress installation. There are plenty of well-made free themes, and you can modify an existing theme to suit your own needs. Now the disadvantage of that is that a pre-existing theme is generic. Okay, so it's not made with your specific website or its content in mind. So obviously it's never going to suit as well your content as a custom theme might. And depending on how much customization you end up doing to a theme, it might actually end up taking you longer to modify a theme than create your own theme from scratch. Okay, and then, I mean, also being generic, you've got to accept that, especially if you're going for particular unique branding, okay? If you're using an existing theme, there's likely going to be hundreds of other people who have the same theme. Okay, so using a very popular free generic theme is not the best way to make your website stand out from the rest. So the alternative to that is creating your own theme from scratch. Okay, disadvantages, obviously it's going to take longer, more investment in time and potentially money if you've got a budget, if you're having to pay people to make it, and obviously you have to learn how to make themes. So the advantages are essentially the flip side, okay, that they're unique, completely flexible and customizable, you have complete control over the resources, and I've got an advantage here, you get to learn how to make themes. Okay, so that's a useful skill to have. You can make a whole career if you want out of just making WordPress themes. There's plenty of work for just doing that. Or you might create your own and sell them. Okay, because WordPress is so popular, you think 20% of the hundreds of millions of websites in the world, okay, there's a big market for work in terms of doing WordPress work. Okay, so let's look at the anatomy of a WordPress theme. What actually makes up a WordPress theme? So as I said, WordPress themes are essentially just collections of files which tell WordPress how to output certain content. They do need to be installed in a particular place. So within the WordPress folder, there's a folder called wp-config, and inside of that there is a folder called themes. Alright, and by default you'll see that they probably have a few default themes in there, WordPress's default themes. Okay, but anytime you install new ones, there'll be a new folder in that themes folder representing the theme that you've installed. Okay, and as I said before, it consists of a collection of PHP files and other resources. At a bare minimum, a theme consists of an index.php file and a style.css. Okay, so you can create a functioning theme with just 2 files. And that's because the index.php file is sort of the default file. If you don't have more specific template files than that, then for every single view it will use the index.php file. So if you had a website where the layout across different sections didn't change at all, then you could just create a theme with one index.php file and then a style.css file. Okay, but that's a fairly boring website and a reasonably unlikely scenario. So this is what this is what the PHP template files look like. Now, I should just clarify, when I'm talking about the difference between a theme and a template, often those terms are used interchangeably. Okay, but when we're talking about developing WordPress themes, okay, the theme, when I say theme, I'm talking about the whole collection of those template files, and then a template is an individual PHP file within that theme. Okay, so you could say a theme is a collection of template files. So I'll look inside one of these template files of an example theme, looks something like this. So this is a screenshot from the header template file for one of the default WordPress themes. Okay, and as you can see, it's a bunch of HTML interspersed with bits of PHP. Okay, so very similar to the process that we looked at in our introduction to PHP in the tutorials. Okay, except instead of writing a bunch of our own PHP, generally what we're doing is calling various WordPress functions here, okay, which will go and retrieve information about the blog and output them in that part of the template. Okay, so this section here, this blog info function is a function that WordPress defines, and we can pass it different variables. In this case, we pass it the variable name, and it will return what we've put in the settings as the name of our blog and output it there. Okay, so in this way, we go and change the name of the blog in the settings. This template will always output whatever the current name of the blog is in the settings. So that's essentially what our template files are. Okay, it's our HTML built up and our content stripped out and replaced with calls to WordPress functions. Okay, so a lot of these functions, a lot of these WordPress functions that are designed for use within the templates, WordPress calls those template tags. Okay, but they're actually just PHP functions. Okay, so WordPress uses its own PHP functions called template tags to output information to the page. So for example, in the next slide, okay, this is sort of explaining what I just said. The next slide, the template tag blog info is used to get the name of the site from the database and output it within the title HTML element. Okay, so that's there is in the actual template itself, and then this is the result of viewing the source. So when I took this screenshot, it goes for a different unit, but there it is, output Dave's KIB216 blog. Okay, so we can see the result of that in the browser. Okay, so obviously this saves us from writing a lot of our own PHP code. So where do we find out what data WordPress can retrieve from the database and what PHP code retrieves it? Well, you can retrieve pretty much any information that WordPress stores within the database. Okay, but in terms of how to figure out what template tags or what functions do that, well, we can look at the WordPress codex, the WordPress documentation. So there's a section here on template tags which lists all of those. Okay, so there's that function there that I showed you the screenshot of earlier, get header. So this is why we don't have to go and look through all of the WordPress install files, because the documentation here lays it out nicely for us and tells us what functions exist. Okay, so here's this one, get header, which says it includes the header.php template file from your current theme directory. Okay, and there's multiple other ones that do various different things. Okay, and we'll go through some of the common ones of these in the tutorials as we're doing examples. I guess the other thing to say about WordPress is it can look intimidating at the beginning because there is so much potentially here to learn, but the thing is you'll probably only use a very small subset of the functionality in any given website. So you really only need to learn as much as you need to learn to do what it is that you need to do. Okay, and basically you just learn a bit more at a time when you need to add more functionality. Okay, so there's template tags reference, and then there's also the function reference. I don't really know. It's a little bit arbitrary why they've split these up. Okay, there are functions that don't do template things, but then there are some functions that do. But anyway, these are all just documentation for different functions in WordPress. Okay, you can look at how other themes do it. I would suggest, commonly people go and look at the default installed themes. I probably suggest against that because they're quite complex themes and can be difficult to understand. If you want to look at existing themes, you can find starter themes, okay, or look for a starter theme or a blank theme. I think there's one called Bones or Skeleton or something, which is just a very basic theme that doesn't do much. You're better off looking at a simple theme, trying to learn things first rather than a complex theme. And the default ones, as I said, tend to be complex. Or you can Google the answer. Okay, so again, just like you would Google how to do something in PHP, this is an example of Googling how to display a blog name. Okay, and alright, you get the very first result is a link to that reference of the blog info, get blog info function, which does exactly that. Okay, and then obviously we're going to learn how to do a lot of this stuff in the tutorials as well. Okay, so when we look at the, I guess the logical page structure of a WordPress template, okay, the WordPress page structure can logically be sectioned into a number of blocks. And each of these blocks corresponds to a separate PHP file in the theme directory. And I've got a note here that WordPress expects these files to have a particular names, okay, like header.php, footer.php, sidebar.php, etc. And I'll explain why that needs to be the case in a moment. Each block or file can be included and reused in multiple page templates using template tags like getHeader, for example. Okay, this is all very much akin again to what we did in the last tutorials, where we were just sectioning off bits of modular content, so we didn't have to retype them out in every single page. In this case, we do the same thing. So we don't have to type out the header in every single template, and the footer and the sidebar and whatever. We section them off into different template files and then recombine them into other template files when we need them. In this case, not writing the include code ourselves, but calling these functions like getHeader or getFooter. Okay, so that's just another way of viewing this diagram here, which is what it looks like on the front end. Okay, and in a single view or a single page, okay, we can see that the different parts of this page are being taken care of by different template files. Okay, so again, much the same as we already did in the previous tutorials. Okay, and that's again just demonstrating how this particular template, the index.php, okay, is including these other bits. Okay, so the header, the sidebar, and the footer. Okay, so we need to talk about something called the template hierarchy. So a logical question to ask is how does WordPress know which templates to use for a particular part of my site? And the answer to that is it uses a combination of what the URL is requesting. Okay, so WordPress knows what type of content you're requesting based on the URL. If you remember, I talked a little bit about get parameters in PHP, where you can say you can send information to the server as part of the URL and saying I want this page with a particular ID. Okay, WordPress does a very similar thing, so it knows if you want to look at a single page, it knows if you want to look at a category, it knows if you want to look at a particular list of tagged posts, okay, and it uses that then to load a particular template file. Okay, so for example, if the URL is for a single post, WordPress will look for the single post template, okay, which is called single.php. If it's for a category, it will look for a category template, which is called category.php, and so on. Okay, and this is the reason that you need to very specifically name your template files this way. Okay, because what it will do is go, okay, you're viewing a particular category of posts. I'm going to look in your currently active theme directory for a file called category.php. And if you name it something slightly different, it won't find it and it won't use that template file. Okay, so the documentation will detail exactly how you're meant to name these template files. This here is what looks like a rather large and unwieldy flow diagram, is a representation of the logic that WordPress uses in order to select a particular template file from the theme. Okay, so I'll see if I can load this up in the browser so we can zoom in. Okay, so going from left to right, okay, it basically asks what page or what type of content am I viewing. Okay, and so for example, a simple one that goes straight down is if I've done a search, okay, there's built-in search in WordPress. If the user's done a search for content and it wants to display search results, okay, then it will look for a file called, if I can get it over here, search.php. Okay, if it's going to look for a page, okay, then it's going to come down here and look for various different versions of page.php. Okay, and then there's various different ones for categories. Okay, and tags and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's a lot of potential template files here. Okay, but the point is, basically this is all a fallback mechanism. It'll go, so these templates here are all listed from more specific to less specific. So for example, let's say you've got a particular category. Okay, then it can come down here. You can actually style different categories differently by having a template which has category and then hyphen and then the name of the category. Okay, so if you had 3 different categories, you could have 3 different templates called category hyphen photography, category hyphen web design, category hyphen graphic design, and you could style those 3 different category views differently. Okay, it might be subtle different. You might just have a different background color. It might be completely different layout. Okay, so what this does is it will first of all look for a template with category and then the name of the category. If that doesn't exist, it'll look for category and then with category hyphen the ID of the category. If that doesn't exist, it'll look for just category.php, in which case all categories will be styled the same. And then if that doesn't exist, okay, it will look for a template called archive.php, and then ultimately, if none of those exist, it will just use index.php. Okay, so this is how index.php, this is how you can have a theme which just has an index.php. If none of these more specific ones exist, it'll use index.php to render the content on every view, no matter what type of content you're looking at. Okay, and that actually works. So this does look big and unwieldy, but the point is, again, you'll rarely ever use all of these template files. You just use as much of this or as little as this as you need to make your website work. So if you don't need different categories styled differently, then you don't need to create separate category templates. Okay, if you don't need a search page, then you don't need a search template. Okay, you just use whatever templates you need to make your website work. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the most common template files. So these are files which I would say most of your websites would end up using. And you'll notice it's a small subset of that entire template hierarchy. So I've got index.php, which is the default front page. Okay, when you go to your website, this is the template that it will use. It's also the default template for everything if no other more specific templates exist. Okay, usually it displays an excerpt of recent posts, and we use something called the WordPress loop to output posts. Now there's almost a whole tutorial in the loop itself, so we'll go over that in more detail in the tutorials, but that's essentially the bit of PHP code which sets up a loop construct. So I talked about loop constructs in PHP, a for each loop. each time you go to a particular view or a particular page, okay, some content will be returned from the database. The WordPress loop loops over that content, and then you output each individual content item within that loop on the page. Don't worry about the details of that now. We'll go over that in the tutorials. Usually the index template includes a header, a footer, and sidebar template files if you need them. And as I said before, if you include no other template files, index.php will be used to output everything, every view on the website. Header.php usually contains the doc type, metadata, and head section of the HTML document. Often it contains the top navigation. You can include the header in other template files to avoid duplicating the code it contains with that function there, get_header. Footer, very much like the header, is anything you would normally put in the page footer, and you can include it in other template files using the function get_footer. The sidebar, okay, any of these can contain whatever you want, but obviously it's logical to include certain types of things in certain templates. So sometimes a sidebar might contain a navigation, it might contain other links or a search form. In the case of WordPress, a sidebar is unique in that you can put things called widgets in it, which are a special type of plugin that allows you to drag and drop little bits of content, but I'll speak more to that later. And you include the sidebar in other template files with the function get_sidebar. And then there's an optional parameter here, name. So you can actually have multiple sidebars, and you can include one or more of them in a template by specifying the name in the parameter for that getSidebar function. Single.php is the template that it will use if you're trying to view the content of a single post. Okay, so let's say you have a listing of a bunch of posts, and then you click on the title or the read more link, and it will open up the entire post by itself. Okay, so when you're looking at that view, WordPress will look for a template file called single.php. And if you have comments on your website, usually this is where you'll include comments as well. Okay, and again, usually includes the header and footer template files. Page.php is the template file it will look like when you're actually viewing a page content item. Okay, so as opposed to a post content item, if you're viewing a page content item, it will look for page.php. Now, if your page and your page view and your single post view are the same, okay, you might omit both of those and just use the index template to view both of those. Okay, but if you want them different, then you can optionally create individual templates for a single post and for a page. Okay, now in terms of taxonomy, so when we say taxonomy just means a way of categorizing things. Okay, and in WordPress, we've got two ways of categorizing things, using categories, okay, and using tags. And they're similar, but tags essentially operate across categories. Categories are much more hierarchical. You have a category and a subcategory, whereas you might have posts in different categories that have the same tag. Okay, so one sort of works vertically and another one sort of works horizontally. So it can be useful to have pages that only show posts in a given category or with a certain tag. And you can provide a navigation menu that links to various categories and/or tags as a way of sectioning your site's content. So this is a screenshot of a slightly older version of Smashing Magazine's webpage where they actually use, so Smashing Magazine website runs off WordPress. They use WordPress categories for the sort of major sections of their site, and then they use tags for the subsections of their site here. So each of these bold menu items will link to a view which shows posts of that particular category, and as far as I'm aware, each of these smaller ones will link to a post which shows only posts tagged with that particular tag also within that category. I think that's how it works. I think that's how it works in that particular case. Okay, but the point is we can use categories and tags to section our content. okay, and we can then use category or tag templates, okay, as a way of styling that view a particular way. So category.php is a template file for displaying any category of posts. Okay, so if we just have a category.php, all right, then it doesn't matter what category we're looking at, it will use this template to display them. But if we want to go more specific than that, as I said, have a specific template for a specific category, all right, then we can add essentially a suffix to that name, so category hyphen and then something, and that suffix can either be what's called the slug. Now the slug is just essentially a way of saying it's the name of the post, but it's a URL-friendly name. Okay, so things like apostrophes are removed and spaces are converted to hyphens and things like that. Okay, and that's something that you can find in the when you look at the post in the admin section itself, or when you create a category, it will tell you what the category slug is there. So you can either specify this based on the category slug or the category ID. So the backend will also show you the ID of any category that you create. All right, and then if there is no specific template for a given category, then it will fall back to category.php and then ultimately back to index.php. All right, and sorry, I didn't update this title. This should say tag.php. Okay, but it's the same deal for tagged content. All right, we can have a generic template for all tagged content, or we can have more specific templates using the tag slug or the tag ID. Search.php is a template for displaying search results. Okay, so there's a widget that you can use it as a search form, and all you have to do is drag that into your sidebar, and then the user can type in there, hit search, and then that will go to a particular URL which lets WordPress know that these are search results, in which case if it exists it will look for a template called search.php so it knows how to lay out those search results. And usually that's just a very brief excerpt of the post. Okay, and again, if search.php doesn't exist, it'll just use the index.php file for the search results. Okay, functions.php is a little bit different in that it doesn't map to a particular view. Okay, so the functions.php file in your, if you use it in your theme directory, is simply just a place that you can store PHP functions that your other template files refer to. It's automatically included by WordPress, so you don't need to use include or require statements before accessing it from another template file. Okay, often if you want to add more advanced features to your theme, you'll need to add some functions to the functions.php file. And you can add your own there if you want. Okay, and it can be anything, any PHP function that you want to add, that you want to call from another template file, you can add to functions.php. Okay, so here's just some more links to more detailed documentation about the anatomy of a WordPress theme. Again, we'll be going into this in more detail in the tutorials. And there's links down here again to the WordPress documentation about the different functions and template tags you can use. Okay, just a brief word on navigation menus. There's sort of an old way and a new way of doing navigation menus. The old way was to use a template tag called wp-list pages or wp-list categories, and that would output a bunch of list items and links, which you could then click and it would send the URL to, if you were listing categories, that particular category, or if you were listing pages, that particular page. So that's the old way of doing it. There's a new and a better way of doing it now, which is much more flexible. So as of WordPress version 3, you can now implement menus that are customizable in the admin interface with the drag and drop interface. Okay, it looks like this. So you can create one or more menus, and then you can add to that menu any combination of pages or categories that you want, or even external links. Okay, and you can organize them in whatever hierarchy you want as well. Okay, so you can have menus with submenus and whatever else that you want. So once you've done this, the WordPress function wp_nav_menu can be used to output the menu within a template. Okay, so you call that wherever you want the menu to be output. It will still be output as a bunch of list items and links. Okay, so you can style it just like you would any menu in that fashion with your CSS. And you would probably pass this function a parameter if you had multiple menus telling it which menu you wanted to output at that particular point. Okay, so what about the CSS, which we haven't really mentioned yet? Well, this is probably the least different part of developing a WordPress theme. Your CSS still just sits in a CSS file. Okay, so remembering when ultimately all of this stuff from WordPress gets output, okay, what the browser is just going to see is a page of HTML and content. Okay, so the CSS still applies exactly the same. The CSS is not applied server-side. The CSS is downloaded and applied by the browser. Okay, so you just think of your CSS as styling what the browser ends up seeing. The only real difference is the way that you'll probably link the style sheet can get a bit confusing because your theme directory is in a subdirectory of the WordPress installation. Things like relatively pointing to different files can be a bit difficult in WordPress. So it offers some functions which will return things like the directory of the theme or the link to the style sheet URL and things like that. Okay, so this is how you would normally link to the style sheet in a WordPress theme. Okay, using this blog info style sheet URL. Okay, and that again is why the style sheet, your main style sheet, is expected to be named a particular way, and in the case of the WordPress, style.css. Okay. Now, installing themes. So let's say you've got your theme, you've created your theme, or you've downloaded a theme that already exists. So installing themes pretty easy. First of all, WordPress looks for some predefined text in a comment block at the top of style.css so it can display this information about the theme in the administrator interface. So this is, again, one of the default theme examples. It's got a comment, and this is the very top of the style.css file from that theme. Okay, it's got a bunch of information here about the theme itself. Okay, name, URL, description. Okay, and so that information will be output here in the administration interface once you've actually installed the theme files. And it also looked for a file called screenshot.png in the template directory to provide a preview thumbnail of the theme. Okay, so once you've actually created your theme, what you can do is load it up, take a screenshot of the website running it, and then save that as screenshot.png in your theme directory. Okay, and then when someone else is installing it, okay, that will show a little preview of that there, and then this information is drawn from that comment section at the top of your style.css file. So actually installing the theme is just a matter of you can either install it through the admin interface itself, okay, or you can simply just drag the theme folder with your FTP client into your wp-content-themes directory. Okay, and then as soon as that theme folder's in there, as long as everything's named correctly, you should be able to go into your admin interface to the theme section, and it will show a little preview of the theme. So that's the WordPress themes administration interface. Okay, so you can see there's a tab there which allows you to install themes via that. Okay, so just a brief word on extending WordPress's core functionality with plugins. Okay, so we already get a lot of functionality out of WordPress by default. Okay, so that I guess they include the most common features that people need. There's no point including absolutely everything in it, otherwise it would be enormous and there'd be lots of stuff that a lot of people never use. So they include a certain amount of functionality, and then they provide a way to basically add on functionality to that through a plugin interface. So you can add plugins to WordPress that do pretty much anything you can imagine. Okay, so some common things that I was just looking through the plugin directory at what was popular, and some were contact forms. There's plugins to check your comments for spam. There's security plugins. There's plugins that do search engine optimization on your site. There's ones that do social networking integration. Okay, but pretty much anything you can imagine. Maybe there's a plugin that does a particular type of gallery slider, you know, goes and gets some sort of information from any website, integrates your Twitter account. Really, literally almost anything you can think of, any functionality that you want, there will probably be a plugin exist for it. And if there isn't, you can always create your own. Okay, but pretty much anything you could create with PHP in a database, you can create as a plugin. So WordPress hosts its own repository of free plugins at wordpress.org/plugins, and again, additionally, there's other websites that offer both free and paid versions of plugins. And again, you could make a very good career out of just creating and selling plugins for WordPress if you wanted. Okay, so plugins like themes are simply collections of PHP files and other assets, and they can either be installed again via the admin interface as a plugin section, or you can drag a plugins folder to the WP content plugins directory. Plugins need to be activated after they're installed. So you can install a plugin, but then there'll be a section of your interface, okay, of which this is a screenshot for the plugins, and you'll notice that these have a deactivate button. So in this case, these are all activated. But you can have a plugin installed but not activated. So the files will be there, but it doesn't actually do anything. So there's reasons you may want to have that. You may want to temporarily disable a plugin when you're debugging a problem with your site, but you don't want to have to go and uninstall it and reinstall it. Or perhaps you have a plugin that you only use occasionally, and you don't want it using up resources when you're not using it, in which case you could deactivate it rather than uninstall it. Okay, but every plugin you install starts off as deactivated, so you have to manually go and activate a plugin after you install it. And finally, there's a particular category of plugins called widgets. Okay, and they're essentially designed to be little bits of modular content that administrators can easily switch in and out of templates on their site using a drag and drop interface. Okay, so this here on the left is a section of the widgets interface area in the admin interfaces, where you can select various different widgets to appear in a sidebar. Okay, widgets always have to appear in a sidebar template. And you can drag their order around, and then ultimately when the page is rendered, this is what they look like. So there's a calendar widget, okay, which outputs a calendar like this, a search bar widget, okay, which outputs this, okay, and handles all the functionality so that when you type in there and hit search, it will go to the search page, a recent post widget, okay, and then there's all other sorts of different ones as well.